we're very, very pleased to welcome Professor Danon, who is going to talk about her research in Izmir. You'll see that on the topic of the seminar, she has also written a book called The Jews of Ottoman Izmir, which is available from the Stanford City Press. So, of course, we would encourage everybody who likes the seminar this evening, which I'm sure will be everybody, to buy a copy or order one for their institution. Well, I think that's enough by way of introduction, and now we give the floor to our speaker. So please, you're very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the kind invitation, and thank you to everyone for joining, even in the midst of such ominous world events as Craig and I were discussing this morning. So I'll share my screen and share a few slides with you. Let's see. Okay. Can you see that slide okay? Yes?
Yes, that's fine. Yeah, absolutely clear.
Okay, wonderful. So I don't want to presume that, I know that you haven't had many talks dealing with the Jewish community in the Ottoman Empire. And so I wanted to start off by saying that the Jews of the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman heartland in the Eastern Mediterranean came to the empire as refugees from the Iberian Peninsula after 1492. And so they came and pretty much found themselves in Ottoman lands for hundreds of years after that, the benign neglect that the state showed them. And so they spoke a Judeo vernacular called Ladino, or Judeo-Spanish. And so the sources that I'm dealing with are coming from that kind of cultural milieu. So I don't want to presume that I'm not presuming any sort of background knowledge. So if there are any questions that you have for me about any of the terminology that I use or any of the topics, please feel free to use the hand raise function or just interrupt. It's completely fine. I'm happy to address so it's clear to everyone. But with that, I'll start, and the talk really deals with the research that is included in my book, but I'm happy to field any other questions you have about Jews in the Islamic world or Jews in the Ottoman Empire more broadly. So in 1899, the Jewish community in Ottoman Izmir came to a near standstill. The death of Chief Rabbi Abraham Palachi in January of that year had led to the first transfer of rabbinic power in over 30 years. The ensuing turmoil over the appointment of a successor, as well as a range of problems that had long plagued the communal administration, now bitterly polarized the community. Most contentious was management of the local kosher meat industry, which, through the levy of a regressive sales tax known as the gabela, generated the overwhelming majority of the community's revenue. Warring factions advanced competing visions of how a new chief rabbi might improve the system, lessening its inefficiencies and distributing its burden more equitably. In the spring, La Buena Esperanza, then Izmir's longest-running Ladino periodical, published a fictional dialogue between Simon and Reuben, distilling the arguments circulating in the community regarding payment of ritual slaughterers. While Simon remained skeptical about changing the traditional system, Reuben insisted that the shochatim had monopolized communal coffers for too long. They engaged in a protracted debate that goes against the religious rulings. Reuben, I beg you, enough. The rulings were made in other times. Now our public is poor. If it cannot support itself, should it die to help others? Is this something new? There have always been shochatim. We never complained. What has changed now that we should pick a fight with these good people? It's true that this evil is quite old. If we pick a fight with them now, it's because of how things have spun out of control. What would you prefer? That they exploit the people, cost us more than 100 kurush a year, cause conflicts, and as they say, ignite the community? Until now, we tolerated it, but we no longer want anything to do with them. Reuben's position pivots on a keen awareness of a changed socioeconomic reality. While the Jews of Ottoman Izmir had prospered in the city's early modern period, playing an essential role in its emergence as a major port in the 17th century. By the 19th century, a constellation of global and local factors had combined to destabilize their position. By the time La Buena Esperanza published Rubin and Simon's dialogue in 1899, the Jews of Izmir were no longer the customs agents, tax farmers, and translators they had once been, but rather greengrocers, tailors, peddlers, and beggars. So dramatic had been their downfall that in the late 19th century, 1/3 of the Jewish community in Izmir reportedly subsisted solely on charity. Yet, as I argue in my new book, most significant about Rubin's read of Jewish poverty was not its prevalence, nor its exacerbation in the 19th century, but rather its position in a larger rupture between agora, or now, and otros tiempos, or other times. Rubin's understanding of agora and its ability to necessitate new solutions to old problems, like that of the kosher meat industry, was undergirded by numerous. For Rubin, Izmir's Jewish poor constituted a collectivity that might intervene in communal affairs and advocate for itself. This collectivity represented itself through the its interest through the vehicle of el público, the public, which might not only check abuses, but mount a lasting challenge to traditional religious authority. Moreover, Rubin's palpable indignation suggests that the Agora of 1899 had ultimately compelled a reconsideration of poverty itself, betraying a sense that its unchecked persistence and expansion was not only undesirable, but fundamentally unacceptable. It's Rubin's understanding of how the modern age had reordered such social hierarchies that animates my book's central interpretive claim. By 1899, the impoverishment of Izmir's Jewish community had come to stand painfully at odds with modern attitudes that recategorize poverty as a social ill, as well as with the triumph of local middle-class values. It's this disjuncture, this rupture with a centuries-old worldview, that poverty as a natural, acceptable, and even stabilizing force in society that propelled Izmir's Jews to engage in a series of modern initiatives. And while communal leaders typically denounce the community's socioeconomic decline as a source of weakness and decay, my book demonstrates the reverse, capturing how the growing empowerment and self-awareness of Izmir's poor and lower classes catalyzed a dynamic reimagining of the Jewish community and its varied institutions. Underlining all of these transformations, of a robust Ladino public sphere in which the needs of el pueblo, the people, were constantly debated with recourse to an expanding vocabulary of rights. Yet even more important than shedding light on an overlooked Eastern Sephardic community are the ways in which Izmir, as a case study, invites a reconsideration of assumptions that have long governed the study of modern Jewish history. Prevailing conceptual paradigms such as assimilation, acculturation, integration, secularization, among many others, are largely the intellectual legacy of reflection on the Jewish experience in various European contexts. And while European communities differed in many respects, across nation states and empires alike, Jews in Europe were often confronted with the notion that their cultural distinctiveness was somehow incompatible with the modern age. From the absolutist Russian Empire to the German nation state to the secular French Republic, European Jews had to contend in some way with a homogenizing pressure resulting from a relentless tension between the universal and the particular. And this is a tension that they negotiated in countless ways. Yet the view from Ottoman Izmir reveals these categories to be of little interpretive value. While never static, failing social hierarchy refracted through the typically flexible Ottoman interpretation of Sharia law, coupled with the profound ethnic and religious diversity characterizing the empire itself, cultivated a social fabric that was not only tolerant of difference, but predicated upon it. The legitimation of religious and ethnic distinctiveness persisted in the 19th century despite and sometimes even in concert with efforts to promote other forms of shared belonging, such as the Ottomanism of the Tanzimat reform era or the constitutional fervor of the Young Turks. This continued affirmation was notably the case for Sephardic Jews as opposed to their Greek and Armenian neighbors, as their position in the Ottoman landscape was not complicated by the rising tide of various nationalisms. For the long arc of Ottoman history, the legitimacy of Jewish difference was simply not in question. As I argue in my book, the Ottoman landscape then requires a different set of questions. What happens when Jewish distinctiveness is wholly unremarkable? What happens when Jewish communal autonomy is not only tolerated, but affirmed, amplified, and even cast as a necessary precondition for the modern age? What types of change might we anticipate when there is no Jewish question? Following Izmir's Jews on the street and in the marketplace, in the home and in the synagogue, the view from late Ottoman Izmir suggests that it was new attitudes to class, not Judaism, that most significantly influenced this Sephardic community's encounter with the modern age. Interestingly, Purim celebrations, and Purim is a late winter holiday on the Jewish calendar. So these celebrations that would happen annually constitute a useful point of departure in this regard. Nowhere in Turkey or Bulgaria is the festival of Purim celebrated with as much noise, bustle, and animation as it is here, remarked one observer in 1891, detailing a boisterous street scene of lights, brass bands, myrtle branches, lamp-colored Venetian glass, costumed revelers, and drunkards. Despite such enthusiasm, the sources reveal that Purim was a perennial source of anxiety for Izmir's Jewish leaders. Rabbis, lay leaders, and journalists alike vehemently denounced the festivities, frequently urging the Ottoman authorities to ban them. Although carnivals were a major source of preoccupation, particularly vexing was the local custom of distributing charity to a large procession of beggars through the streets. And this was a procession that lasted from morning until nightfall. The anxiety leaders expressed about the procession is rooted in the dramatic changes the city itself witnessed in the modern age. Along with the reconfiguration of Ottoman administrative practices, legal systems, and commercial codes as a result of the Tanzimat reform movement, also came a transformation of urban space. Like other Ottoman cities, Izmir became a laboratory for the implementation of a Western approach that prized order, rationality, cleanliness, and the safeguarding of the public good. New rail and streetcar lines, public utilities, new docks, customs houses, and a seaside pedestrian promenade called the Cordon dramatically changed the city's built environment. A significantly expanded volume of trade made the city a hub for foreign merchants, who now comprised 1/4 of its total population. New cafes, restaurants, hotels, and department stores abounded in what travelers called le Petit Paris de l'Orient, Little Orient, while its non-Muslim majority led the city to be labeled Gavur Izmir, or infidel Smyrna, in the eyes of Turks. Izmir's Jewish leadership demonstrated a keen awareness of the changes taking place in the city. The local Jewish press abounds with articles chronicling Izmir's transformation into a modern municipality, with copious reports lauding the efforts of local authorities to stem epidemics, prevent crime, improve the city's cleanliness and hygienic conditions, and safeguard the public peace. Sephardi newspaper editors constantly reinforced the notion of a partnership between the municipality and its residents, urging their an active role in transforming the city into a well-ordered and clean modern space. Yet such a partnership was complicated for Izmir's Jewish community. Both internal census records and Western accounts alike point to the indigence that marked Izmir's Jewish neighborhoods and the considerable number of beggars on their streets. By the late 19th century, the preponderance of Jewish beggars on Izmir streets increasingly clashed with a growing discomfort with public displays of poverty, in the modern city. Such discomfort was undergirded in Ottoman cities by the adoption of a European approach associating begging, especially on the part of those who were perceived to be able-bodied, with disorder, laziness, and sin. The Ottoman state itself implemented a range of policies reflecting this attitude, first banning begging in 1890 and fully criminalizing it in 1909. Already by 1878, Izmir's Jewish community had established the Gabbai Tzedakah, the Stewards of Charity Society, with the express purpose of removing Jewish beggars from the streets. Its administrators ambitiously centralized the collection of all local charity and distributed it in weekly installments called manadas, only to those deemed officially worthy after an investigation into their circumstances. The early activities of this society are recorded in this defter, and this is a veritable treasure trove for reconstructing how poverty was lived and imagined in the Eastern Sephardic diaspora. Despite the successes of Gabbai Tzedakah in concealing the community's poverty, Purim, with its raucous carnivals and public distribution of charity, unfailingly made it public. Reflecting a deep sense of embarrassment, observers lamented how it allowed misery in all of its shapes and colors to take to the streets. Yet notably absent from any of the criticisms that surfaced every winter on the part of lay leaders, rabbis, and newspaper editors, and their voluminous, is discomfort with the nature of the Jewish holiday. At no point do Izmir's Jewish leaders express any apprehension about putting their ethnic, religious, or cultural difference on display. As Izmirlis and as Jews in a plural Eastern Mediterranean city, they had undoubtedly seen their Christian neighbors do the same, be they the pre-Lenten celebrations of the Greek Orthodox or the Corpus Christi processions of local Latin Catholics. What preoccupied them was not a declaration of Jewishness, but its annual unveiling of the poverty it had worked so hard to hide. With its carnivals and begging processions, Purim put the community's diminished socioeconomic state on public display. In this little Paris of the Orient, this was a painful disjuncture that they preferred to conceal. Sorry, my office is right above this like enormous construction zone. So I apologize if you're hearing as much noise as I am. So the remedies proffered to solve this problem reflect a second angle of the community's social transformations. To remedy the embarrassment of street carnivals and begging processions, communal notables promoted other, more dignified Purim rituals and particularly in the form of charity balls and theater performances. Increasingly commonplace in Izmir by the 1870s, such events became prominent around Purim, given the holiday's emphasis on caring for the needy. Referred to as balls, dancing soirees, evening parties, these events were represented in the Ladino press as elegant and brilliant affairs. They were typically sponsored and attended by the upper echelons of the community, usually emanating either from the ranks of the communal leadership or Izmir's small number of Jewish mercantile elites. On the surface, these balls were held to raise funds for local charities, yet they operated on a symbolic level as well. In addition to the funds they raised, these events promoted a profound link between two cornerstones of bourgeois life, philanthropy and respectable leisure. A discourse emphasizing the harmony between these two values is evidenced as mentions of charity balls in Izmir's Ladino press. In advertising upcoming balls held by Izmir's Greek and Armenian communities in 1878, La Esperanza claimed that, quote, alongside entertainment, there must also be charity. In reporting on the multitude of charity balls that would become commonplace in the coming years, the paper would constantly laud those who made their attendance at such events un placer y un deber, a pleasure and a duty. Lending even more prestige to these events were the venues in which they were held. Traditionally, Jewish charitable activities were associated with communal facilities, such as the office of the chief rabbinate. Yet Izmir's physical transformation over the course of the 19th century soon provided its Jewish community opulent new spaces for its charity events. The numerous public works projects undertaken expanding the port and rationalizing street layouts facilitated the construction of numerous clubs, hotels, theaters, and cafes. Among the most famous of these venues was the Sporting Club. And this was a grand waterfront building that also had an attached theater in 1893. And it served as an exclusive gathering place for Izmir's mercantile elite. And it frequently hosted productions staged by European theater and opera companies. Jews are not prominent amongst the club's membership, but by the turn of the 20th century, Jewish charitable institutions had begun renting the venue for their own events. Most notable among these were the semi-annual theater and musical productions staged for the Ozer Dalim Society and the Talmud Torah School. And and that is kind of blurry for you, I apologize. But it is the Grand Hotel Kramer and Palace, which was called in its time a splendid edifice that surpassed many great European hotels in luxury and elegance. And this also became a preferred venue for Jewish events. Notably, the Jewish elites attending such events were frequently joined by numerous Ottoman officials and local consuls. In 1883, a ball celebrating the inauguration of a new Alliance Israélite. This is a French-Jewish philanthropy that established schools for Jews across the Middle East and North Africa. And Izmir had a handful of schools affiliated with Alliance, and this is the new building that they inaugurated in 1883. And the party they had was attended by the local governor, officials from the army and the police force, the director of the Ottoman Bank, the director of the new Izmir Kasaba Railroad, the local Catholic archbishop, and the consuls of 10 countries. Interestingly, a special prepared for the harem of the governor general of the province, who attended the party as his sons were students at the local Alliance school. And even more revealingly, engaging in charity allowed upwardly mobile Jews in Izmir increased socialization with their non-Jewish neighbors. While Izmir's role as one of the empire's most active ports had always facilitated interaction between mercantile elites of different religious groups, the changing physical landscape of the city in the 19th century, along with the cultivation of Western social norms, gave rise to socialization beyond the world of commerce. Cinemas, clubs, theaters, and boat races are all known to have attracted mixed crowds. Given this changing environment, affluent Jews in Izmir saw increased socialization with their Greek, Muslim, and Armenian neighbors through their engagement in philanthropy. Among the numerous examples of such patterns is a 1907 benefit for the Talmud Torah. This is a school, and these are the orphans who lived at the school that educated and housed hundreds of impoverished children. The party, however, was held at the Sporting Club, which you just saw, and the festive evening featured live music, theater, and poetry readings. Forming the honorary committee were the president of the municipality, the director of political affairs for the province, the chief of police, and a host of elites from Izmir's Greek, European, and Armenian communities. And here's the program for the evening. And you can see Mademoiselle Cohen, she recited a poem by Victor, and that was followed first by a duet sung by two Greeks and a monologue recited by an Armenian. And closing the entertainment was a duet performed by two women, one British and the other Italian. Thus, a charity event for a Jewish school, which was a long-standing communal institution where nearly 500 destitute children were instructed in Jewish texts according to traditional methods, was attended by, in the words of a newspaper, the most refined enthusiasts of this public. Philanthropic endeavors, such as the 1907 Talmud Torah ball, challenge our understanding of how Jews entered the middle class in the wider Jewish world. And this is a slide of the Al-Granati family. This is a sort of picture-perfect embodiment of how these ideas of bourgeois family social ideal that becomes so prominent in the Eastern Mediterranean. So the way we typically think about how Jews entered the middle has long been rooted in the experience of Jews in Central and Western Europe. And the scholarship on how Jews become bourgeois in these places is typically emphasizes the need for Jews to kind of sideline or even their religion and culture to become middle class. From Paris to Vienna to Berlin, scholars have shown how acculturation for aspiring bourgeois Jews was not typically accompanied by the integration it sought to facilitate. In England, for example, even baptized Jews associated quite closely with one another. But the view from the Ottoman Empire, and Izmir in particular, suggests a stark and instructive contrast. Absent in the Islamic world was the demand that Jews modify or abandon their Jewishness. Western Jews ardently adopted middle-class values in service of demonstrating their fitness for citizens, their worthiness of equality or emancipation, their inclusion in the nation. And yet for Izmir's Jews, the process of becoming middle class wasn't born of such tensions. Unlike their Western co-religionists, who, in the words of one scholar, needed to be openly middle class but invisibly Jewish, for Izmir's Jews, making a monsieur out of one's son, which is what they called it, was fully compatible with one's Jewishness. And so we also find Izmir's Jews negotiating these new constructions of social class within the community itself. And this happens most notably with respect to taxation. So this might get a little technical, but I'm going to do my best to lay it all out, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. So here's some background. So the empire in this period is adopting centralizing reforms in the 19th century. And even though there are these reforms, the empire's multiple religious groups basically continue to manage their internal affairs with very little intervention from the state. So they maintain their institutions, they educate their children, they tend to their poor, they manage their finances. They kind of operate as like a mini state, and the Jewish community manages both external taxes that are due to the Ottoman authorities, like the jizya, for example, which was the poll tax for non-Muslims. And they also manage internal taxes that are meant to sustain communal institutions. In Izmir, these expenses are covered by revenue generated from sales taxes on kosher goods. And the idea here is that the religious directive to consume kosher food or food that's considered ritually fit would make kosher meat, but also sometimes wine and cheese, a dependable and constant stream of revenue. These were known in the community as gabela taxes. And just, it won't surprise you that these are sales taxes basically. And as we know, sales taxes are essentially regressive. They burden the consumer much more than his wealthier counterpart. And these ultimately emerge as a source of relentless class conflict. So I'll add another little piece of background and say that these structural tensions are exacerbated by the competing interests of a broad range of stakeholders in this system, in this kosher meat industry. So you have the people who are trained in slaughtering the animals according to the ritual, what's ritually prescribed. You have people selling the meat in the marketplace. You have people sort of borrowing a model from the Ottoman state, and people who lease the tax outright and collect it later on. And then you have different liaisons to the state, the kayafis. They kind of either communicate the directives of the municipality regarding pricing, or they help move the meat from the slaughterhouse to the marketplace. So you can see there's just the sheer volume of stakeholders involved makes this system very volatile, and attempts to reconcile their conflicting needs and demands always yields contentious decisions. And I'm dwelling on this because it's hard to overstate how central this is to understanding how the Jewish community functions in Izmir. And this might not be clear on the surface. They don't have any other financial instruments like income taxes based proportionally on wealth. And so these sales taxes on kosher goods are the backbone of the budget. And you can see this in how various factions harnessed it over time. So in 1888, for example, a group dissatisfied with communal oligarchs instituted an independent butchery with the goal of, quote, ruining the tax, arguing that this was the only way to force the hand of the chief rabbi. Even the mere threat of external butcheries preoccupies communal leaders. And we see this in 1897, when a group of Russian refugees fleeing persecution look to settle in Ottoman lands and find themselves in Izmir and start building out the structures of a community, and they seek their own building for prayer. The local Ottoman Jewish community in Izmir reacts with uneasiness, noting immediately with fear the potential for them to eventually secure their own team of ritual slaughterers. And this is the license. This is what a license would have looked like for someone doing the ritual slaughter of cattle. So just to say that, in the words of one newspaper of the time, without the meat tax, quote, there would be no schools, no Talmud Torah, no hospital, and our cemetery would turn into a pile of rocks. Another newspaper, El Pregonero, put it this way: the rabbinate is meat, it is slaughterers, it is butchers, it is cattle. When there is meat, there is community. So Jewish communal autonomy in Izmir ultimately lay not in the rabbinical courts and not in lay councils, but in the slaughterhouse. In the 19th century, we find Izmir's Jews engaging this perennial source of class conflict in new ways. An increasingly common strategy was to shirk the tax entirely through the consumption of non-kosher food. In 1882, for example, the Communal Council rejected a proposal to levy additional taxes on kosher meat to help cover the cost of refugees fleeing Russian anti-Semitism. As the leadership noted, when there is a gabela tax, it is certain our people will eat non-kosher food. In 1886, growing numbers of Jews were reportedly buying non-kosher meat rather than pay the inflated price of 9.25 kurush per oka. This is twice the price being charged in Izmir's other communities. And 10 years later, some even wondered whether the tax would remain full. Are we certain that in only a few years, the consumption of kosher meat will be sufficient to maintain the institutions of our community? So again, in contrast to European Jewish communities, in Izmir, it wasn't ideology, but the havoc wrought by socioeconomic disparity that catalyzed the abandonment of religious traditions. Consumption of non-kosher food was not the product of a critique regarding the compatibility of Jewish ritual with the modern world, and not a commentary on the relevance of continued rabbinic authority, but rather a product of deep-seated and polarizing class conflict. In contrast to Germany, for example, absent in the multi-ethnic Ottoman case was a Schachtfrage, literally the slaughter question, that was yielded by the perceived clash between Jewish ritual and the homogenizing framework of a nascent German nation state. In Izmir, it was actually the state that often intervened to protect and sustain the kosher slaughtering system, shielding it from abuse at the hands of self-interested butchers and even imprisoning slaughterers who bypassed the directives of the community. The increasing consumption of non-kosher meat was accompanied by the emergence of an expanding range of tools for criticism of the tax. New bulletins, pamphlets, associations, petitions, even political parties. There's no better entry point into this Ladino public than the bitter conflict over rabbinic succession that roiled the community between 1899 and 1901 that I opened with. When Chief Rabbi Avraham Palachi died in January of 1899, after having held that position for 30 years, conflict over the appointment of his successor ensued immediately. In the spring, a group supporting the candidacy of his son, Solomon, took the provocative step of bypassing the council and pronounced him chief rabbi. To solidify this move as a reality, the first step his supporters do, they send immediately people to the slaughterhouse and give them instructions to begin slaughtering animals on behalf of the new administration with Palachi at its head. This leads the communal council scrambling to enlist its own slaughterers and basically leaves Izmir's Jewish community with two dueling administrations. The Palachi camp makes the removal of this tax its battle cry. What right do we have to crush the poor with taxes, they say, and force others to irrelevant? In a community where direct personal taxes don't exist, the poorest among us have more of a right to control communal affairs. Indeed, when the governor general of the province begins to take an interest in this mini coup d'etat, asking for a list of plotters, the key figures emerged as a rag and bone man, a mender of sacks, 2 greengrocers, and 2 fruit sellers. Now, contention around this tax was nothing new, but by 1899, the two sides of the conflict thought of themselves not merely as nations, but as partidos, parties, each with a platform on the gabella. Ultimately, these parties crystallized into 2 distinct camps, signified by the term palachista, pro-palachi. These are people who campaigned to lift the tax, and colelista, those who sought to retain it. It was these new party affiliations that dictated how Izmir's Jews engaged with the conflict, as they expressed their political positions through an expanding repertoire of behaviors. And this is an ad for a local department that's addressed to these, to people who understand themselves as affiliating with these new political platforms, palachistas and colelistas in 1900. So elites are going to express their positions through communal administration, approving or denying subsidies to one faction or another. But a broader segment of Izmir's Jews found ways to express their loyalties as well. Given that Izmir was now home to 2 dueling administrations, each with its own staff of ritual slaughterers, the purchase of meat from one party or another evolved into a mechanism of modern political expression. As El Meseret, a Ladino weekly newspaper, noted, until now in the city, there had been 2 Jewish rites, Ashkenazi or European Jewish, and Sephardic, Middle Eastern Jewish. And now there are 3. The paper recounts numerous anecdotes testifying to the deep, now encoded in consuming meat slaughtered by one faction or the other, expressed by families around the dinner table, siblings playing in the street, consumers in the marketplace. Such debate was still present a year later when hundreds of people sent a letter to the chief rabbi of the empire, decrying how people had boycotted kosher meat in order to avoid supporting the Palachista party. Similar to Izmir's aspiring bourgeois, tracking the discourses and practices around this tax demonstrate not only the simultaneous existence of both Ottoman and Jewish spheres, overlapping and even mutually reinforcing nature. And here, for example, we can look at a Ladino pamphlet entitled Shavat Aniyim, The Cry of the Poor, which is a Hebrew title, but a Ladino pamphlet. And it's published in 1847 on behalf of El Pueblo, the people. And it charges the communal leadership with dishonor and abuse, with oppression and humiliation. And it further condemns the oligarchs for treating the poor as slaves, taking no pay and abusing them much more than we were abused during our enslavement in Egypt. So here they are drawing on a biblical narrative of, enslavement of the Israelites. And the pamphlet also claims that Izmir's Jewish poor were more coerced than the Anusim of Spain. These are Jews who had undergone forcible baptism at the hands of the Inquisition. So it's very, very strong language. The pamphlet enumerates the different strategies Izmir's Jewish poor had tried to combat the Gabella, boycotts, secession, even apostasy, all to no avail. In the pamphlet's retelling, it would only come from an external source, the Tanzimat, the Ottoman state, the sweeping set of changes that, among many other things, promised to reassert the authority of the state over the empire's ethno-religious groups and their sort of oligarchies. The people have the freedom of our Lord King Sultan Abdul Majid, who ordered that with the beneficial reforms, all of his flock is liberated and free, declared the pamphlet. We don't understand who can force us to be slaves to people we have no obligation to serve. Now empowered by the Tanzimat to liberate themselves from communal oligarchs, Shavat Aniyim expressed relief that Izmir's Jewish poor could rightfully be subject to the law of Moses. Seen through the eyes of Izmir's Jewish poor, it was thus the Ottoman Sultan who was the ultimate protector of Jewish law, wresting it from the corruption of the community. The mutually reinforcing nature of these discourses became only more amplified over time. In the wake of the Young Turk Revolution in 1909, the satirical El Soitari published the Agada de la Carne, the meat Haggadah. And another word of background, in case it's not familiar to you, a Haggadah is a text that is read in the home on the holiday of Passover at a ritual Passover Seder, and it recounts the biblical narrative of the Exodus. So this was common in the Sephardic world. It became a kind of sub-literary genre, this sort of parodies of the Haggadah in different contexts. And so in 1909, we have the meat Haggadah. And so they use the template of the traditional Passover story and recast the biblical narrative of the Israelites' oppression, enslavement, and ultimate liberation as the ongoing struggle for freedom from the injustices of Izmir's kosher meat industry. So in the original text, it reads, "We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Avadim hayinu leparo b'Mitzrayim." The satirical version reads, "We were slaves to the butcher in Izmir. Siervos fuimos al kasab be'Izmir." The text goes on, framing the kosher meat industry as enslavement wrought by Izmir slaughterers and butchers, and it celebrates the Constitution of 1908 as the liberator. And again, using the traditional text as a model, it states, "If there hadn't been no constitution in Turkey, we, our children, and our children's children would still be enslaved, powerless to free ourselves." And it celebrates how it was the Constitution that took us out of slavery, not by the hands of a messenger or unknown people, but by Niazi and others. So I'll offer a few conclusions, and I'm happy to take your questions. I think the case of the Jews of Izmir invites us to reconsider the many insights to be gained, not only by including Sephardic Jewry in larger historical narratives, but in using their experience to rethink how we understand the wider encounter between Jews and the modern age. For the Jews of Izmir, the modern age, as they understood it, demanded that they reconsider not their relationship to Judaism, but to poverty, its public visibility, its causes, its remedies, even its very legitimacy. Thus, Jewish holidays preoccupied them not because they publicly declared their ethnic difference, but because they unveiled the poverty that the community had sought to shield from view. The ever-escalating attention directed at the kosher meat industry was rooted in controversy, not over Jewish ritual as a marker of difference, but rather the reconfiguration of a traditional system that might be sensitive to the cry of the poor. These examples, among many others, reflect that the challenge as they understood it wasn't how to minimize their religious distinctiveness or even harmonize it with that of a majority, but how to harness it in service of new social hierarchies. And I'd also like to add that I think by prioritizing socioeconomic class, we can open up new vistas not only in the study of Jewish history, but in Ottoman studies more broadly. If you focus on class, you often there's a potential basically to eliminate important parallels between the experiences of Jews and their Muslim neighbors and Christian neighbors that are obscured by the often uninterrogated social taxonomy that people kind of take for granted in Ottoman studies, you know, a Muslim or a dhimmi, or a Muslim or an ex-dhimmi. It also productively unsettles the category of Ottoman non-Muslim, which is often used as a kind of code or a shorthand for the empire's commercial bourgeoisie. If we focus on class and the spheres in which it is most visible, like work, the family, the neighborhood, the street, I think it gives us much needed tools with which to test, refine, and reappraise categories that are often taken for granted, like coexistence, for example, is often thrown around as a paradigm in Ottoman studies. So the approach I tried to take in my book suggests that it's not only possible, but actually very likely that the vision of progress held by a Jewish dock worker in Izmir was much more similar to that of his fellow Muslim dock worker than to that of a Greek or Armenian merchant on Frank Street. ultimately, what I've tried to do in the book is tell the story of a neglected community, and through that story to enrich our understanding of both Ottoman and Jewish modernity and the place of the Sephardic diaspora within it. And I hope not only to have claimed a voice for Jews and the world they inhabited, but to argue that their experience as beggars and as rabbis, as housewives and peddlers is of profound historical significance. So with that, I think I'll stop sharing the slides, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Well, thank you very much indeed for a very, very clear, well illustrated and fascinating presentation. So I think that we can all say that we've learned a very indeed. Whilst colleagues are thinking of their questions, and I hope there'll be many, I was wondering whether you could just outline a little more for us, for those who are not completely familiar with this part of the history, as to why the Jewish community in Smyrna appears to have fallen into poverty, because you contrasted their earlier, more exalted state with the later one. I was wondering whether you could outline that process for us.
Sure. Basically, as I mentioned, in the early modern period, they were very much embedded in certain structures related to the economy of the state. So tax farming and customs and those types of things. And as the state begins to struggle in the late 18th century, 19th century, their knowledge of all of those systems becomes less valuable. Also, the world economy is kind of shifting, and there are other groups that are better positioned than they are in the new economy. And so Greeks, for example, in Izmir they are the powerhouse of the city, and they kind of they don't control the economy, but they're extremely prominent in all sectors. And that's because they're well positioned on the supply side and the demand side of the economy locally there. And so, you know, the knowledge that Jews had of Ottoman texts and things that get rationalized in the 19th century becomes less valuable. And so other people are able to step into that niche. So that's basically.
Is it just knowledge? Because, of course, conventionally, in that kind of sociological analysis, we would think that once somebody's got into a good position systematically, although occasionally some people may fall out of it, most of the time the community would manage to build on that. And it wasn't, for example, because as the bureaucracy professionalized within the Ottoman Empire, that other people were being appointed to these posts. And
yeah, for sure. I mean, all of these changes, these rationalizing changes that happen, that all of those shifts, you know, leaves them kind of dislocated. And so certainly it has to do with all of those broad shifts that are going on in the imperial bureaucracy, et cetera. Yeah. But so I think it's harder for, it's often, because it's in the provinces, not that it's unimportant, but it's often, you know, the empire is always engaged in this kind of struggle between the imperial center and the provinces. And so it's harder for them to regulate what happens outside of its seat of direct control. So that's always a struggle that they have.
Yes, thank you. I shall think about this some more. Now, do we have any questions from the floor, please? I see that Andy's here. Andy Finkel, would you like to? Andy, do you find this picture plausible? You're muted, Andy.
You can hear my glorious voice. That's great. Yes, your question was a good one, and I'm, as you say, it's the answer must be more complicated. The question I was going to ask was perhaps it's an unfair one. I mean, how does the community survive into the Republic? I mean, what happens with is that something you know about? I mean, is it with the abolition of the Sultanate? how do these communal struggles resolve themselves or don't resolve themselves, or change once the republic is declared? But perhaps that's not something you've gone into.
I haven't in the book, but I know that the community, these struggles don't go away just with the move to the republic, that there still remains, there remains some significant class conflict, which is why I was drawn to this case study in general, because I was interested in social history and the everyday. And it seems, to the extent that there's any discussion of Izmir, at least in Jewish history, it appears very, very in a very limited way. It shows up in the early modern age, actually the hometown of a messianic movement in the 17th century that fizzles out, and then it just disappears off the face of the map, except for these moments of class conflict. And so I was drawn to this case study to sort of try to establish why that is, and what are the structural reasons for why this keeps exploding there. But the community also dwindles into the Republican. I mean, it starts to contract. So, I mean, right now, I don't know if anyone's done a proper census recently, but I think that it's no more than 2,000, or to be honest, I think they keep citing census numbers that are quite outdated, but I think it's about 2,000 Jews in Izmir. When I was last there, that's the figure that I was given. But that also includes a kind of mini diaspora of people who might have been born there, but have migrated elsewhere to Istanbul or other places. So it's very much a shell of what it once was. At its height, it was 25,000, which was about 10% of the city's total population. But in the Jewish historiography, it also gets short shrifted because it's not the imperial center of Istanbul. It's also, I don't know if you've had any talks or have heard any mention of Ottoman Salonika, which was a Jewish town in the late Ottoman period. And so it's neither of those. And so it's kind of always relegated to the footnotes of the narrative. Like it was never that important, and from the Ottoman perspective, because the focus has always been about the Greeks and the sort of Mediterranean cosmopolitanism. And from the Jewish perspective, it was totally marginalized.
I was sort of more interested in the 20s. I mean, or sort of when the burning of the city, or
yes, well, they're not subject to the population exchanges that ensue, and so they witness a lot of the violence, but they come out on the other side of it, is still in a stable position. They're not like severely dislocated by that. I mean, as residents of the city, they are, but not specifically as a Jewish community.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm just having a negotiation with my son here, who's just about to go off out. It's a downside of working virtually away from one's institution. But yeah, I mean, I think many small groups in Turkey have contracted. That's absolutely fascinating thing. I mean, the point that again that Andy makes is very, very well taken. I would be surprised if the numbers are anything like those that you mentioned.
Yeah,
but it's absolutely, yeah. Sorry, Andy?
I said there are probably 5 Jews left in Izmir.
Yeah. But
well, there are definitely more than 5, and I know that for a fact. But I know that, I don't know if any of you have followed, or maybe now that you've come to the talk, it'll look more familiar. But there is this initiative on the ground in Izmir there was a very dense population of Jews in one particular. And so there's this local initiative that's being supported by the municipality, and I think even perhaps on the national level, to have it designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So there is efforts, at restoration, and there are many synagogues that were not destroyed, they're just abandoned, and this is something that happens across the Islamic world as people kind of unmix, and it's not that Jews were kind of out, but these places find themselves falling into disrepair and disuse, and so now there's a kind of initiative on the ground spearheaded by the community to turn this into a cultural center. So this is something that it's actually not specific to Turkey, that many places like to make a kind of a little industry out of like the Jewish community that was.
I'm a great fan of Dario Moreno, who's the
oh yes, he's done.
I share this this fascination.
Yeah. Yes. Have you? If there is a street named after him.
That's right. Yes.
Any more questions, please? Just jump in if you would like to ask one. Don't be shy. Just unmute and go ahead. Oh, you need to unmute yourself first, Gunnar. You're still muted. You're still muted. Yes, you'll need to unmute yourself. Oh dear.
For her? Can you do it for her or not?
I can't, but Craig can. Can you unmute Gunnar for us, Craig? You're still muted, Gunnar, if you can hear me. You'll need to unmute, press the unmute button. Well, just whilst that process is happening, is
it better?
Now we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, I made it.
You made it. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I am in Izmir.
Oh, wow.
Thank you very much. It was a lovely talk. And also everything is quite new to me about Jewish people in Izmir. And yeah, I know some friends, I know, some people in trade that are Jewish. I didn't realize they were that, established over there. So it was quite new. Being in Izmir, I didn't know all your history here. It was interesting. And I will read more. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Can I just speak?
Please.
Yeah. Dina, thank you so much. It was a really wonderful talk. Clearly presented. I understood everything. It was really lovely. I'm not an academic, unfortunately, but I read both Paradise Lost and Smyrna, and absolutely amazing history. One of the things I really learned reading about Salonika was the harmonization between the ethnic groups there, the religious groups, the Greek metropolitan, the Jews and the Christians, and how the empire appeared, as you so rightly say, to allow them to organize their communities, collect taxes, and conduct their religion with really very little interference from the Ottoman state, the Porte, providing that they obeyed the other rules that they were given. And it was a very, very harmonious community for a very, very long time. Yeah, I've been to Izmir lots and lots of times. Family lives quite close by in Cheshme. There is a lot of Jewish history there, and there's evidence of Jews coming through an awful lot. My wife has an uncle there, and he is so beautifully Jewish, even though he's Turkish. All his expressions are wonderful, his sense of humor and everything. Of course, the Sephardic Jews came over from Spain, didn't they, when the Muslims threw them out, and the Ottoman Sultan agreed to take the Jews, and they appear to have just blended into the community, beautifully run the finances and all that kind of stuff. And for a long, long time. My big surprise was your description of the poverty. I mean, obviously there was poverty there, and I'm very surprised because the Jewish is such an enterprising nation that there was a lot of poverty among that particular community. But you explained very well, I think, how times were changing as they always do. And although they were absolutely supreme at interpreting the Ottoman tax system, which must have been hugely complex, the Greeks really appear to have run over them and embraced the modern world and began to capitalize on the changes, as you say, started with the Tanzimat reforms and carried on and then accelerated with the turn of the century, and particularly the Republic and all the changes that Ataturk brought in. But it's good to hear that. I mean, Izmir particularly is so good at highlighting its wonderful heritage with not to get political, but it's a CHP administration, and they do seem to care about the city, particularly recently. And they are going ahead, regardless of other politics in the country. They've made Izmir, which was a beautiful city, such a beautiful city. All along the waterfront is just beautiful, and the mountains that surround it, such a lovely city to live in. And the lady from Izmir, such a wonderful place to be, and I love it. And it's really good to hear that they are going to, because also I remember when you said about the empty synagogues, Salonika has the same thing, I understand. And after the disastrous population exchange, there were large empty churches, empty synagogues and all that kind of thing. Some of them synagogues are really beautiful inside, but of course they've got rubble and rubbish and just left empty, and it's so sad. So it was very pleasing to hear that they are going to be doing that. So anyway, once again, thank you so much. Really interesting, lovely photographs, absolutely wonderful, reminding me of the old streets of Izmir, which so many are still there, and long may they be. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Hi, I want to say thank you as well. Very informative talk. I'm curious, I was born in Izmir. The lady Izmir in Izmir is my mother. And
My daughter.
A lot later. I'm curious, which is the area of Izmir that was habitated by the Jewish population?
Kemeraltı Bazaar, like right around the Kemeraltı Bazaar. And then they migrate, well, Karataş becomes a kind of a place for kind of upwardly mobile, like if they could afford to leave the market area, like then they would go to, that was considered, they called it the suburbs, even though it's not very far, but it was then. And yeah, and now I believe there's a small pocket in the Alsancak neighborhood. But yeah, it was the reason I have this photo. I mean, well, my book came out basically, I think only a few days after the pandemic was announced. It's not a great time to publish. And so I was Zooming a lot from my home and from my children's playroom, and I was looking for, you know, appropriate backgrounds over Zoom. And anyway, this photo is of it's the gritty kind of street scene that I wanted to capture in the book. And I found the photo in the Getty archive, but I couldn't get the permissions to put it on the cover. So it's in the book, but this is actually the photo that I wanted for it conveys that kind of everyday life, you know, poverty, street scenes, the market stall kind of, but that's, yeah, the bazaar.
Thank you.
I would like to ask you about your use of the two words poverty and class, because we tend to try to draw a distinction between them analytically. Poverty clearly is lack of money, lack of wealth. class tends to be a bit different because it implies certainly some kind of structural difference, which I'm not sure was there. I mean, I'm happy to be convinced if you think it was, but we're talking about poverty more than class here. And I'm wondering whether you're using the two words interchangeably or you do mean something slightly different by them.
I think they're related concepts, but they're not interchangeable at all. I mean, and it's not to say that the modern age invents poverty. Of course, people, you know, this is just built into human society. It's not, you know, it's not something that's invented by the modern age, but it's that shifting. I think that the modern age brings kind of attitudes towards that lack of wealth, where it might have been perceived to be okay and even stabilizing, like to the point where in the Islamic world, we have cases like Aleppo, for example, in the Ottoman period had being a beggar was a profession. Like there was a sheikh in the guild, and it was considered an acceptable part of the landscape that, you know, there were beggars. It was a job. And in the modern age, you know, that starts to be regarded as inappropriate, that it comes to be associated with laziness, with, especially if you're perceived to be someone who can work, it's perceived to be, you know, sinful almost in the modern age. And so it's not that, it's not that the modern age creates social stratification. It just like brings new vocabularies and attitudes to it. So I don't think poverty and class are interchangeable at all. They're adjacent, you know, adjacent concepts.
I see. Because you see, I'm not sure. I should explain. I'm a social anthropologist. I'm not sure that we would use class in that way. I think we would probably say perceptions of poverty have changed, which is entirely convincing. I think your argument is, I should say, yes, absolutely convincing that clearly if something has been legislated for, becomes publicly embarrassing, it does help cohere the mind. It helps concentrate the mind, say, look, we've got to do something about this, which I think is your argument. But class implies to me anyway, a structural difficulty. And that is terribly relevant here, because the question is I think you're saying is that it was possible for many of the people who were now becoming ashamed of their poverty, as modernization began to set in, it was in fact possible for them to, as it were, escape the poverty trap. I think normally one would argue sociologically that if a very powerful class system is operating, it then becomes very difficult to oppose the class divide or to overcome the class divide. So in a way, unless I misinterpret your argument, you're actually implying that classes didn't exist in Izmir, because the fluidity, you see, which you emphasize.
Yeah, but to me, class is much more in the sense of Bourdieu as a social hierarchy, as a repertoire of performances. That class is less as like an economic faction, and more as a, you know, that's closed. And it's not that you get a membership card to the bourgeoisie, you know, but you adopt certain practices and behaviors and performances that kind of help you affiliate with that class. So it's that's what I mean by, you know, the cultural ideal in the Ottoman port city here is a bourgeois. That for them is what it overlaps with the meaning of modernity. That's kind of how they understood being modern, is just sort of not a blind imitation, but that's the ideal that's in place, that all groups are engaging with, not just Jews, you know, Ottomans of all religions. And so that's what I mean by class is not a firm kind of, you know, is impenetrable, you know, in between them, but more of a set of performances that, you know, to announce oneself as middle class does require the material component, like the resources, but it's also the public kind of performance of those things. So dressing a certain way, you know, giving certain names to your children, in a certain area, reading certain books, you know, frequenting certain cafes. It becomes very prominent, this divide between things that are a la turca and a la franca. You know, so do you want to be a bride that's a la turca, or do you want to be a bride that's a la franca? And a la franca, you know, meaning you want the white lace and the Western trousseau, and because you're transmitting something about your position, your social position.
Yeah, that I think is terribly plausible, because that's precisely the conversation that we see even now.
Yeah, of course.
Was the one that was surrounding the Young Turks. But the Bourdieuan argument, I think, certainly I was thinking of Bourdieu when you were speaking, because you see, of course, he said not so much chercher la femme, le grand-père. It's what your grandparents were doing that helps make you survive.
Yeah.
And clearly, if the Jewish community in Smyrna were doing quite well, and then for a couple of generations they fell into poverty, somewhere here there is the memory, or indeed in his kind of terms, the cultural practices that help one to come out of that trap. And so I suppose the obvious question then is, to what extent were they drawing upon their previous memories of a better position when they recreated their nations in a changing Ottoman Empire? Do you think this trope of what we used to be was in fact relevant?
I do think so. I think when you read the Ladino press, and I think there is, but you know, it's very hard to disentangle in the late Ottoman period from the kind of almost auto-Orientalism that's happening, where all of this stuff kind of intersects with the Orient as this repository of backwardness. And, you know, when the Alliance comes in, for example, right, they come with this discourse that's very, very heavily inflected with the civilizing mission. So, oh, look at, you know, we Jews of Paris, we're coming to, you're so lucky because we're coming to civilize you, and you've fallen into poverty because you're prone to barbarism because you live in the East and you're superstitious, etc. And so that trope of what we once were, that certainly, that is present, but it's I find it very hard to disentangle between that kind of discourse that's very imbalanced between East and West. You know, that, and in fact, when Western observers come to Izmir to you know, write reports about the community, they say, oh, you know, the Jews of the Orient are backwards, but they're super backwards here. There's something really backwards about them here. And of course, it's because of these attitudes around poverty, etc. And it's not to suggest that every single person is impoverished. It's just a significant, it's just very visible in the community. It's not a majority, but it's very visible.
Yeah, I understand. Any more questions or thoughts for our speaker? Please go ahead, Simon.
I think will be my wife, Danon.
Hi, Dina. Thank you so much. It was so interesting. I'm Jana, and I'm from Izmir, and of course, it's like all of you, I love Izmir very much. And what it was interesting was that is the notion of community forming around the profession, and like is selling meat is kind of like is get them together, and then they created their own bourgeois from that, and I find that very, very interesting. I have read this book by Yaşar Ürik about parts of Izmir, and there was something is, I think it's slightly relevant to this, about is how a community is actually dominates way of make you know, profession, or like is a way of make living, and how it's formed around that. And the story is like is in early 1800s. There's this drunken sailor, but with a drunken sailor rushes ashore, and then the locals, they don't understand who this person is, and according to Yaşar Ürik is a local historian, so he's just like anecdotes have some you know, merit to them. So because this sailor apparently was black, and the locals didn't see black people, and so they didn't understand who this was. And so this local sheikh, a holy man, Muslim, sees an opportunity there and says, oh, this was actually a holy person. Apparently there was a storm a couple of days before. So he was sent to Izmir to protect the city. So they bury him there, and around the grave, it becomes kind of a shrine. So this is what used to be Bahri Baba Park, which is not there anymore. And the story goes that is this sheikh starts making money from grave selling, because everybody wants to be buried near this grave. So the graveyard around that area grows and grows until it's actually become adjacent to the Jewish cemetery.
Right.
I think that there are still big Jewish cemeteries in Izmir, historic sites. I haven't been, but I know there's some in Bayrakli and that part of Izmir. And the story ends that is apparently then the sheikh, I can't remember his name, he realizes that there's this friction between Jewish community and Muslim community about ownership of graves. It's bad for business. He tries to mediate between the two to stop like having a little war in Izmir. And the story goes that is apparently one day between the border between the two cemeteries, a little girl fell under the horse riders as they were riding. So this little girl under the horses' feet, but somehow she survives. And then the two communities start arguing which ancestors actually protect this little girl. Were they like Jewish ancestors from the Jewish cemetery, or the Muslim ancestors from the Muslim cemetery? So then the sheikh intervenes and then says like it was actually the good example of how the ancestors, the souls of Jewish people and souls of Muslim worked together to save this little girl. And apparently then they made up, and they didn't live happily ever after, as we know, but I think it was a good anecdote in that book. And I think it was also interesting from what you said, like is how these ways of making money, selling graves, selling meat, informs a community, like is how they survive and how they make their living. So anyway, so I just want to say that.
Thank you. Yeah, I did go to cemetery in Izmir because again, my grandparent is the city of their birth, and I went with a list of graves that I was looking for, and I was basically handed like a bucket and a brush. It said, go have fun. I spent the day cleaning graves, looking, and I did manage to find some people.
Did you find your grandparents' graves?
I did. I found my grandfather. Yeah, he's buried there.
Oh,
Yes.
Thank you.
Any more for our speaker, please? Well, I think if we have no more comments, I think we can just say with some reluctance, we just have to thank our speaker for an extraordinary illuminating talk, and wish her all good fortune for her new book. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation.
Thank you.
And of course, please feel free to join in our seminars in future. And you know where we are now. It will be a pleasure.
Yes, thank you.
Well, I'll say good night now to everybody until the next occasion. Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.